today, there's no comparison. It's night and day. It's a 180-degree turn. But, I truly believe, I went through the things that I went through to be able to understand the people that we're working with now. A lot of times we focus, so much on the behavior of what we see on ESPN, what we see at the bottom of the ticker, but the thing that's most scary is the things that you don't see, the suffering in silence.
Someone once said a person had to be crazy to be in a sport where the object was to slam heads and bodies together on a regular basis for the purpose of going after a little odd-shaped ball. Now, it might have been a joke at the time, but no more. Former college and NFL player Marin Cogan III was recently detained and taken for a mental health evaluation after police were forced to respond to a home Barbara was in. It's not clear the root cause, but it does speak to a growing concern about football players and their life after the game. Let's welcome to Midpoint from ESPN the magazine, where the recent article spoke to a growing mental health crisis in the NFL. Marin Cogan joins us today. Marin, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Your article appeared in the ESPN the magazine July 7th comeback issue, and it focused on Brandon Marshall. He is only 30 years of age. He's a Pro Bowl wide receiver for the Chicago Bears. He is one of the better players in the league, but he has been diagnosed, and this is not new, 3 years ago with mental health issues, and we hear so little about it. I think people will ask why at least one, that first click that told us something was wrong, didn't get a lot of people galvanized a lot faster.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the interesting thing about this that I discovered going into this is a lot of times you have sports journalists who are covering these sorts of things on deadline, and it's very hard to know how to even talk about mental health issues. So we might hear that a player has, they'll say character issues or, personal problems off the field. It gets sort of euphemistic because these issues are so hard to talk about. But often I think what it is, or what it could be, is an undiagnosed mental health issue. The early 20s are sort of when mental health issues start to present themselves in a lot of people. You have these young men who are leading very public lives, maybe going through similar things, but it gets sort of filtered through the media, and it's time to take a look at those stories again, I think.
Marin, I think we're going to take our own business to task here for a moment, because you mentioned the media and the people who cover pro football and cover these different sports. Is it not proper to say that there are many members of the media who cover these players on a day-to-day basis, male and female? They see these problems, they hear about them, they know what goes on in the locker room, and many times they do know the problems that these players are suffering, but they simply won't report it because it's bad for business?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, it can be difficult. It can be bad for business, but it can also just be difficult and hard to know how to talk about these things, especially when the mental illness might cause or lead to behaviors that sort of stretch the bounds of empathy. In a case where a player has gotten into domestic violence situations, that is very hard because you want to balance empathy for the victim and also empathy for someone who might be the victim of a mental health issue. So it gets very tricky. It's hard to talk about this. I think the media is starting to try to learn how to talk about it more, but it's almost like we're still developing the language with which to talk about mental health issues as they play out in sports.
Your article was entitled "The Pursuit of Radical Acceptance." Explain that, if you will. Radical acceptance.
Yeah, so radical acceptance is neat. It's sort of based on a Buddhist concept, and it involves just accepting everything as it is. For people who are dealing with anxiety or depression or any number of mental health issues, and this has been extremely helpful for people with borderline personality disorder and suicidal tendencies, if you just focus on letting everything go. And it's sometimes thought of as a paradox that you can begin to affect real change only when you've let everything go. You stop trying to change your past or change other people. You stop striving or trying. You just learn to accept everything exactly as it is. And that has been a really important concept for Brandon Marshall, the player I wrote about who has borderline personality disorder, in dealing with his past and moving forward and making positive changes.
I want our viewers to hear something. This is former Indianapolis Colts player Ben Utek. He was pleading with U.S. senators to provide more funding for brain injury research, and this was after a number of personal struggles with several documented concussions. Listen to this.
For the first time in my life, my brain became a priority. And the reason why it became a priority is because at 29 years old, I started to have memory problems. And it took losing my mind to care about my mind.
It's frightening to hear this. Is it fair to say, Marin, that certainly this is much more widespread than we might want to believe? We all just want to think it's a game, but there are probably dozens, maybe hundreds of players who have some form of mental illness now simply because of the game, and the National Football League has certainly not been doing everything it could to treat these players over the years.
Yeah, I actually had chills listening to that audio segment. I think that this is a much more widespread problem than any of us are fully aware of right now. I mean, even if you put aside the entire issue of traumatic brain injury, which I think is a huge, huge, huge issue, there are a lot of these young men who, you know, become overnight celebrities, right? And they're in their early 20s, this immense pressure of being in the NFL. Some of them have come from extremely difficult backgrounds to overnight being, you know, immensely wealthy in the public eye and expected to be perfect at all times. It's just a very difficult pressure cooker to begin with. And then you add the traumatic brain injury on top of it, the potential for that. And I think we're dealing with what can safely be called a crisis.
I have about 30, 40 seconds left here. And the one thing that people are always going to ask, you'll have one side that'll say, wait a minute, you're going to change the game of football forever. You're going to destroy the game that we love here in America. The NFL is certainly thinking about the money that they make. The players want to play the game. What's the answer here? You would have to guess the game's got to change sooner or later.
Yeah, you would think so. And I think that answer is going to come from the players like Brandon Marshall, who have been through these things and are now asking for changes.
Do you think, though, the National Football League will move quickly, or will they only move if it really benefits them in the end?
I think the pressure is starting to mount to the point where it makes sense. It makes good sense for them to start thinking about this stuff seriously. In 2012, they enrolled a whole new mental health program there because there had been so much pressure, and there are lawsuits happening right now, class action lawsuits happening against the NFL. So there is pressure mounting to where it makes good sense for them to start getting a handle on this.
The article, again, is The Pursuit of Radical Acceptance. It appeared in ESPN, the magazine's July 7th comeback issue. I heartily recommend that if you're a sports fan or not, read it, because you're going to learn an awful lot about what this culture is and how devastating it can be to human beings. Marin, thank you so much for your time. Wonderful article.
Thanks for having me.
It is something to think about when you hear players talking about the fact that they can no longer remember, and some players now trying to take pictures of their children and their families so that in 20 years they can remember what they look like, because they know there's a good chance they won't remember because they played football. Midpoint continues.
I've always